Welcome to episode number 83 of the BeerSmith podcast. It's late June 2014, and today brewing author Stan Hieronymus joins me on the floor of the National Homebrewing Conference, Expo, for an interview on brewing around the world. Today's podcast is sponsored by the new video, How to Brew Beer with Malt Extract, which I filmed jointly with brewing author John Palmer. This video is intended for new malt extract brewers, and it walks you through everything you need to brew your first batch of beer with malt extract. Cinematically filmed, you can rent or buy it in just a few days online or on DVD by going to beersmith.com/DVD. Again, that's beersmith.com/DVD. And also, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. The second issue of this new magazine at 120 pages is packed with great advice on brewing saisons, Belgian beers, blending beers, and much, much more. Go to beerandbrewing.com and order your subscription right now. And you can get a 20% discount when you use the offer code BeerSmith. Again, get your copy from beerandbrewing.com and use an exclusive 20% discount using the offer code BeerSmith. This week's episode was filmed on the expo floor of the AHA convention, so I apologize for the slightly elevated noise levels, but I hope you enjoy it. Today on the show, my guest is Stan Hieronymus. He is, of course, the author of Hops in the Homebrewing Element series, as well as Brew Like a Monk. Both of those from the Brewers Association publications. And he's also a good friend of mine, has been all over the world, and he's going to join me. He's joining me live today at the National Homebrew Conference, and we're coming to you from the Conference Plaza in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're broadcasting from the BeerSmith booth. Stan, it's fantastic to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me and putting up with me being late.
So how have you been enjoying this year's show?
First of all, I see more people I know all the time, and that's a lot of fun. But we were talking, you go back 10 years ago, and now the rooms for the presentations, a single room is bigger than the conference used to be, and that's almost a little overwhelming.
Yeah, I've had 500 people in the room last year when I spoke anyways. It was pretty amazing. Did you do it? You did a speech this morning, didn't you?
This morning.
What'd you do? What was your topic?
Talking about the lessons you can learn from monks, which is keeping things simple.
Outstanding. Well, today we're going to be talking about some of your traveling. Can you start with just a quick overview of some of the places you've been recently?
Well, most recently, before I got to Grand Rapids, I was in Hickory Corners, Michigan, where there's a hop farm. You're probably interested in what most people would consider more exotic sites, like you and I were together in Brazil.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Enjoyed that.
And next week I will be in Poland. So.
Really? You're going to Poland. That's fantastic. Well, I thought we'd start with a trip to Florianópolis. We're going to be talking about beer brewing around the world, by the way. That's the topic Stan wanted to talk about today. But I was wondering if you could just share a little bit with us about what you thought about Florianópolis. I enjoyed it very much. We're in Brazil.
These things are always, they're full of surprises when you go down, which you're the one who really discovered this. For instance, in Brazil, they don't do any extract brewing. They just start with all grain. Extract's expensive. They start with all grain. They said, why not do it this way? And it's so they just jump so far forward on the scale. In contrast, I was in Argentina last November, and they have such a hard time getting imports that they struggle to brew a Belgian-style beer is impossible because they cannot get the yeast.
Yeah, pretty amazing. I enjoyed some of the microbreweries we went to down there, too.
Unfortunately, United decided I should arrive later than you, so you got to go to a couple of those breweries. I would have loved to go on to the German-inspired one. But I did enjoy that Sunday when we got in the countryside to go into a town of Brazil that was settled in 1860 and realize that more than 80% of the people still speak German.
Yeah, German beer is very, very popular down there.
And it makes a great base for beginning bringing a beer culture back.
Yeah, they're kind of where we were a few years ago. They've got down in Brazil, they have like one or two very large breweries that provide most of the beer, and it's, of course, all one style, the light Pilsner lager style. And now they're just starting to see some of the other ones come in.
Yeah, and you're right. We did, and you go to places where guys are brewing like 3 hectoliters, which is 2.5 barrels, and then double batching. Then it allows them to make a lot of different things. And so they are exposing people The speed at which people are being introduced to other styles of beers, that's one thing that's different than 30 years ago. It's much faster down there.
Yeah, I very much liken it to where we were in the 1990s when the craft beer revolution was just starting, the homebrewing revolution was just starting. Really amazing changes going down there, but they have a huge advantage over us because they have the internet.
Yes.
And so much information now available on the internet.
As you know better than I'm not sure where your downloads and your sales are in Brazil, but I think it's a great market for you, yes?
Yeah, Brazil's been great. Somebody translated the program into Portuguese, and they've been it's been selling well down there, so I'm really surprised, but it's been fantastic. And, of course, they treated us very well when we were down there.
Yes, that's a wonderful host, as they were in Argentina and other places I go. So
I was wondering if you could comment on some of the beers down there.
Well, I think I drank the largest percentage of what I had were actually homebrewed beers.
Right.
You know, there were some smaller beers. So you had homebrewed beers, and it's surprising. I had some excellent sour beers and lambic-inspired beers, Belgian beers that were the fermentation character was spot on, and then the hoppy beers I had were a little bit more over the board. Obviously, some people are struggling to get fresh hops.
Yeah, it's a problem there. They can't really grow hops because they're too close to the equator, right?
Right.
At least not on a commercial scale.
Well,
right?
they can use Argentine hops. If you go clear down in Patagonia, that's the one place where they can grow hops. Sometimes the people in Brazil don't want to use ingredients from Argentina.
Okay. You also were in Argentina recently. Tell us about that trip.
Well, the people are really excited about home brewing. They've given. I know Gordon Strong was down there giving an exam, and he's also been to Chile giving an exam. So you have people joining the BJCP. Martin Bone is a really important driver for all things beer in Argentina. So both the craft side and the homebrew side. But like I said, a hard thing for them is they struggle to get the ingredients other people have access to. But they're working on that, getting people to do liquid yeast down there, grow their own hops. They certainly have the enthusiasm now. And the homebrew beers I had there, I had some really excellent beers.
I had some great homebrew beers as well. How was the craft beer industry in Argentina?
They're not nearly as far along as Brazil.
Really? So it's just in its infancy then.
Well,
right?
there's some excellent ones. Antares, which is they started as a brew pub, and then they opened a microbrewery that supplies the other brew pubs. And Leo and he's taken a lot of his inspiration from breweries outside of Argentina.
Sure.
They make excellent beer. But there are people there. There are two expats from the U.S. that are a little further north. They're brewing beer. They're just doing regular beer for the immediate countryside. They just happen to be American, so they understand American hops. The interest in American hops, and this is true as you saw in Brazil. It's true in Argentina. It's true in Poland, where I'm going next week. That's really something that catches people's attention.
Yeah, I know they had a fascination with IPAs and hoppy pale ale, some of the other very hoppy styles.
Oh, yeah, and for instance, Artisan, which was the first Polish small brewery opened by homebrewers who stepped up. Mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of contract brewing where people go and use larger breweries, but one where they opened it themselves, and they wanted to make English-style beers and Belgian-style beers.
Right.
And they make some excellent ones. But what's driven their growth is interest in their West Coast Pale Ale and their IPA. That's what, when they brew that beer, that's the beer they have to brew again, because that's what customers are buying.
Now, one neat topic I want to touch on is a lot of these homebrewers are starting to use some of their local ingredients as well. Because they have limited access to, some of the traditional ingredients. They're starting to brew their own local stuff. Can you talk for a minute about that?
Well, I think we saw that more in Brazil than Argentina. Of course, they're doing it with the hops, and they're actually coming up with their Argentine IPA style using their hops, one of which is unique to Argentina, and then a certain amount more wheat, and saying we'll make our beer unique. In Brazil, you're seeing more people using local fruits.
Really?
And then local sugars. So from those trees, in fact, of course, Garrett Oliver went down to Brazil, harvested sugar for Brooklyn Brewery to use. They've also got unique woods, the banana wood that they age a lot of other spirits in, but now people are beginning to put those beer in those barrels, or maybe break those barrels up and put them into the beer. So they start to say, what are the flavors of our country, and they're using those flavors.
Yeah, I did a podcast some time ago, I guess, on brewing in Brazil, and we talked extensively about how they're using so many of the local fruits, especially a lot of the tropical fruits in beer.
Yeah, the fruits, and had several excellent fruit beers. One beer that was a collaboration between Argentina and Brazil, so it's Argentine hops and then Brazilian fruits. It was really nice that the woodiness and the sweetness and tartness from what's a fruit that's similar to cherry, opposite those hops, was it was delightful.
Fantastic. I believe you're headed to Poland next. Tell me about that trip. How'd you get invited to Poland?
They have, for their largest homebrew competition, they come up with a budget. It was first subsidized by Zivich, which is owned by Heineken. It's since moved over to more of the small brewers, where they have a few judges come from other countries. 2 from England. They've had judges in the past from Germany, and will be again this year, from Austria and Belgium. And a couple of years ago, when they started introducing American categories, because their competition they do differently. It's not all categories. They pick 10 categories that will be judged this year, and they announced it last December, and that's what you enter. And so for the American categories, and 2 years ago it was IPA was one of them, they wanted to get an American judge. They were also familiar with Brewing with Wheat, where I introduced Americans to Grodziski style, so that's why I was on their radar.
So that's how you got
So they invited me, and this will be the third year. This year, the American categories are Cascadian Dark, or Black IPA, and American Wheat. And of the 10 categories, the most entered is Cascadian Dark.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And they've gone from 2 years ago, I think there were 340 entries, and this year there are 770.
And I was surprised, Grodziski, I want to talk for a minute about that. Very old beer style, being revived now, fundamentally a Polish beer style.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, it's we refer to it as the indigenous style of Poland because that's where it originated. It's 100% smoked wheat malt with a yeast that was unique to Grodzisk itself is not quite central Poland. North to south, it's central. East to west, it's closer to the west. It's equidistant between Warsaw and Berlin.
Yeah.
And brewing began there about 1500, and it was a very popular beer style through the 18th century and continued, but eventually it disappeared as beer styles do.
And, it was about 1950 or so?
93. It was last brewed in 93. So what the Polish homebrewers realized is in reviving this beer, they wanted to have a beer that the former brewery workers could judge. So the people judging this beer are the ones who worked at the brewery when it existed last. Chances are it's not like it was 100 years before.
Yeah. Most beers aren't like they were 100 years ago either.
They've written their style guidelines to that, and both the Brewers Association and soon the BJCP tomorrow when Gordon Strong talks about that, the style guidelines will be much like the Polish guidelines. So they've really revived it, but they recognize that is not going to drive, quote, craft beer in Poland. It's hoppy styles and sour styles, the same things they're doing here. So
I think you mentioned earlier somebody actually won the long shot competition, right?
Yeah. The Gretzer, Caesar is standing right there.
Yeah, Caesar's actually standing behind the camera. You guys can't see him, but he won the long shot competition.
And using the same recipe as the Polish homebrewers. So,
really? He's jumping in.
Yes, that's true. He is from Brazil.
Caesar's from Brazil, yeah. And he won the long shot contest with the Polish beer.
And I'm taking bottles of that beer, and I will give you feedback what the Polish homebrewers think about that beer, and some of which you probably won't enjoy.
Anyways, yeah, very interesting style, but it's kind of neat that it's entering the mainstream, really. With the long shots, it's going to get broad distribution to a lot of people. They're going to get a chance to taste it.
It will introduce a lot of people, and right now I had 2 homebrew Grodziskis Wednesday. Somebody gave me another one today that's up in my room, and I've got 3 places to go at club night that I need to stop by because they said you need to have our Grodziski.
We're recording this podcast coming from the floor now, but it's Friday afternoon, and we're going to have, of course, Homebrewers Night is tonight.
Yes.
Which is perhaps the highlight of the whole conference.
Not perhaps. It is the highlight.
Well, yeah, I think so.
Other
too.
than me being on this podcast.
Well, yeah, Stan being on the podcast. But so, Stan, you're also a certified BJCP judge, and I know you were judging beers yesterday. What was that like? Judging, you guys had, I think, over 700 final round entries?
It's a final, so up to 36 beers or ciders, meads will advance to the finals from the first round.
So judging you're judging for the National Homebrew Awards, basically, though, right?
Right. So I did Category 15 yesterday morning, which is Vice beers. Something,
right.
And it's a little. I did first round in Kansas City, so you do a lot. I did 5 rounds in Kansas City. Tend to forget exactly what I did. Sours. So it's fun. You get a lot of great beers, and they are literally world-class beers in some cases.
Wow. Now I want to talk about the BJCP overseas and internationally. What's going on with the BJCP in other countries?
Well, and I meant to ask Gordon about this yesterday. I know there are multiple exams in Argentina.
He was here just a minute
ago. And Chile. So in South America, it seems to be a little bit more of a push. And then multiple exams in England. So I know 2 brewers in Poland, one of whom is a home brewer, the other is a commercial brewer, who went to England last year to take the exam. And the commercial brewer, in fact, took English lessons. That was his motivation to take English lessons so he could take the BJCP exam.
That's very cool. So, I mean, we're seeing an explosion in beer judging around the world now?
Well, I think it begins with homebrewing. So you don't necessarily, like there have always been niches of good homebrewing communities, like the Netherlands 10 years ago when I was first working on Brew Like a Monk.
Sure.
You would see lots of people cloning Trappist-style beers and having competitions for them. And where it grows it's hard to figure out why the outbreak is that way. Why did it happen in Italy? But it happened first with homebrewing in Italy, and then craft beer took off in Italy. Certainly, the craft brewers in the United States understand the importance of home brewers. You see, that these rallies at breweries. You look yesterday at the welcome reception, and you look over, and here's Gary Fish, who is director of the board or whatever for Brewers Association. He shows up at an event like this. You see all the Bob Pease is here. The brewing community. The homebrewers are so integral to the brewing community, which has been true, but more people understand it.
Yeah. A lot of time the driving force between new styles, new innovations, even the craft beer revolution, really.
Right.
Driven by a lot of homebrewers.
They're both that, and of course, they're great customers.
Yeah. Well, going back a few years, you visited all the Belgian abbeys when you were researching Brew Like a Monk. What were, and I know you did a presentation today on some of the lessons from that.
Right.
What are some of the takeaways for some of the folks at home that are interested in homebrewing?
Well, at a homebrew level, the 2 parts they are commercial breweries.
Right.
Of varying size. Achel being the smallest because they're basically a brew pub.
Yep.
Westfalen is very popular. They make, what would amount to about 3,500 barrels.
Right.
So half of what Perrin, a microbrewery that opened last year, North have here in Grand Rapids, that nobody's probably heard of. They make a lot more beer. But they do it on the commercial level, but it's part of their monastery life.
Right.
So it needs to be integrated. In some ways, you would think of it the same way that homebrewers integrate what they're doing in their life where it doesn't get out of balance, and you can make it fit and make just as good a beer without hovering over it all the time, without having a lab. Those sorts of things.
So what does it mean to be a Trappist Abbey, to be a certified? I know we just expanded. There's a couple more now.
Yeah, to get the certification means that the beer is going to be brewed within the monastery walls.
Yep.
That the monks oversee it. Doesn't mean they're involved in the physical labor. In some cases, they are. In the whole history of overall, which only goes back modern brewing back to the 1930s, one monk has ever been involved with any part of the brewery operation, and he ran a forklift. At others, like at West Flatland,
so you have to run a forklift to brew like a monk, then, right?
Yeah, exactly. And at West Flatland, they're involved in the physical process, but they oversee. They are in charge of the integrity of the beer and the quality of the beer. So there is a Trappist mark that certifies that.
Yep.
And it just certifies that it's brewed in a monastery. It is not a certification of quality. However, it's worked out that it is a certification of quality. They are all high-quality beers.
Yeah.
And so to allow the St. Joseph's Monastery at Spencer in the United States to become the first Trappist monastery, they were very particular about the quality of the beer. They invested lots of money in quality, not assured that they would have the Trappist mark, which they do now have the Trappist mark.
Fantastic. Well, what are a couple of takeaways from your? You did a presentation. Some of the takeaways from on Abbey Ales, and some of the things that you can learn from the Belgian brewers.
Well, walking out, what people said, I'm happy that you emphasized is fermentation temperature. You look at fermentation temperature, and people see that, golly, West Flatland, they ferment their beer at 84. No, it finishes at 84. It starts at 68. I think one of the most important things is thinking about where it starts. Then that yeast and the fermentation will naturally bring the temperature up, and that way you're going to get the esters, particularly the ester, secondarily the phenols that you want. The yeast, people bounce around. I want to do a Westmalle clone, and I'm going to use Westmalle yeast. I want to do a Chimay clone. What I advocate, and of course, obviously, every monastery there is, they have one yeast strain. Get to know that yeast strain. Make it your partner. My friend Yvonne DeBatz, who wrote the foreword to my wheat book, did the history of saisons for Phil Markowski's book.
Sure.
Always refers to yeast as she. She is your partner. You need to treat her well, and she will deliver nice beer that way. And I think that's the important thing is monogamy in Belgian yeast strains is very useful.
Now, another point you emphasized, because I saw your presentation before, is simplicity, which I think is just so important.
You look at, there are many kiln malts that can go into a monastery beer, but generally only one or two of them do. You can get your color from dark sugar if you're using a colored beer, and one like Cara Munich or Special B, and not too large amount. So keeping those simple, and then when you want to make a change, you make that change. You can see exactly what happened. You got 9 malt varieties in there. Pulling one and in out doesn't tell you a whole lot.
Yeah. When we went to Brazil, we got to see a number of craft breweries, and we saw some interesting things there. I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges they have overseas in building a craft brewery, actually, because a lot of times they can't buy the equipment coming from overseas. And
they do have to hit. I mean, it's the same thing as here. You see people using old dairy tanks. So they track down what they can find, and then they reach that tipping point, and all of a sudden you have fabricators. And again, that's an advantage they have, the small brewers didn't have 20 years ago in the United States, because when people are making tanks for here, then they go, oh, I can ship them down to Brazil. It's not as big a deal to put them on the boat. And the amazing, some of the quality, and obviously it's nice when people in Brazil are making equipment for Brazilians. In Argentina, the same thing. In the United States, the same thing. But certainly a lot of people want to buy German equipment as well. And they are taking that expertise at the large size and all of a sudden dropping it down to where people can get 5-barrel tanks and things like that with that.
We did say that at the Baden Brewery. They actually had all German equipment. He even used German kegs. They were very
and
very
so if nothing else, that tells people the standard that they need to work to, and you didn't even get a look at that standard. One of the challenges,
it was pretty high because they even had a separate mash system to allow so that they wouldn't disturb the mash tank during the. It was pretty interesting, and they also had a separate chimney that was actually curved, so that none of the aromatics would fall back into the wort, basically.
Yeah, I wish I'd had a chance to visit the brewery, but just based on what you and John told me, that he was about as German as you could be.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And the beer was fantastic. It really was. It was amazing.
But what you also learned is the challenge, certainly in Brazil and Argentina for small brewers, is once it leaves their brewery, it tends to go to very warm environments.
Yeah,
and there's no cold storage. There's very little cold transport.
Yeah, most of the beer sits on the shelf, sometimes for months at warm temperatures, which is a challenge.
So that's of course that's still true in the United States too.
Yeah.
So that is one of the challenges they have, given that they're smaller breweries, so their quality control is naturally not quite as strong, and you can get by with a lot. And now talking about the United States in a brew pub, where you make that beer 2 days later, it's already gone. Once you start packaging, once you start shipping your beer, then it tests your quality control a lot more.
Well, Stan, I wanted to give you a minute or two to talk about your hops book at the end here. I was wondering if you had some key points.
Well, I don't want to discourage sales of the hops book and say we're going to have a new version out in 2 years, because it's probably not going to be in 2 years. But it's a funny thing because I talked about Brew Like a Monk and monastery beers this morning, and that book's 9 years old, and the changes are small. Certainly, the availability of dark syrup.
Brew Like a Monk's 9 years old.
Yes.
Hops isn't.
No, hops is a little over a year old.
Yeah.
And that will be the book that needs to be revised the first, because there is so much research and people are learning so many new things about hops. And it's also moved up, and this is another example of what's changed in craft beer, and to an extent, even with home brewing, the market is so much bigger that it finances research that would never have taken place before. So people are looking at how do we get this interaction with hop oils? What compounds do they create? How does it interact with yeast? So for the Argentines who have no access to yeast, so I brought back Argentine hops and then brewed beers with yeast strains they can't get. And then they came to the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver, and I took them these beers. And they're going, this is great. We can do this with dry hop. And I'm going, well, first of all, you got to get 3711, which is the French Saison yeast.
Sure.
But the next thing is for brewers to be able to track and say, these are the compounds we're getting. Right now, everybody's in love with Equinox, which is a really nice hop. I had Jason Oliver made his IPL with, I think, Equinox and Mandarina Bavaria, which is a German hop. Really wonderful. People love it because it has so much oil content, over 3%. But eventually we're going to figure out which are the particular oils that we want. And then you can say, I'm going to take this hop, which has this much oil, and put it with something else, and put those two together to create something all together. And that's the really next exciting step with hops.
Yeah, you did mention in your presentation some of the new hops coming out too. I was wondering if you could just talk for a minute about some of the ones we might see in the next couple of years.
Well,
and, what's exciting about them?
Well, and they'll be more available next year. Are German varieties, the Mandarina Bavaria, Cascades of Mother,
right?
And that's the one that people are using more of right now. It's the lead hop in Easy Jack.
Right.
The new Session IPA from Firestone Walker. Then you've got the Hallertau Blanc, which is a hop you can use. It's not as big as Nelson Sauvin, but in a Saison, it brings some of those wine character, Sauvignon Blanc character, which can also be catty.
Sure.
Then the Huell Melon, which, as the name would indicate, gives you more riper, fruity qualities. And these three are from the German growers. Then Equinox was released this year. and that's from the hop breeding company. So it's the same people as Citra and Mosaic. Then you're going to have some varieties, and we're probably 2 years out before they're grown in the U.S., including Cashmere. That's the one people are excited about. That all these others were private hops.
Right.
But these are new public hops, most notably Cashmere, that people. So in other words, somebody in Michigan can get these rhizomes from Oregon and plant them here in Michigan. They're a public variety, so there'll be excitement about those as well.
Private, yeah.
And Azaza, which is a dwarf hop. It's a daughter of Summit. And that's showing up in some beers now. And Gerillo, which is a granddaughter of Summit, will be out next year. So these are sort of names, and they're not, they're sort of jazzier than saying Simcoe. Nobody knows what Simcoe is from Fort Simcoe near the Yakima Valley.
Yeah. Well, Stan, I was wondering if you could just summarize with a few tips. You've been all over the world. You've met all kinds of home brewers. Give us a few tips from some of the people brewing in other countries.
Well, I think people bring their own culture to the beer. So, like you go to Poland, and they base their score sheet on BJCP, but they changed it a bit. So instead of talking about 3 points for appearance, it's 3 points for color and then 6 points for foam.
Oh, wow.
I like that score sheet a lot. When you look at those and you begin to think about the importance of what your beer looks like,
right,
and how that affects people. I can't really talk about in advance about some of our judging yesterday, but another judge was much smarter than I was. I was ready to kick a beer on the appearance.
Really?
And we're going, well, what about the other? And we go back and the other aspects of the beer were strong enough that it ended up getting a medal.
No kidding.
But to me, appearance is super important. And I think usually when people pour their own beer, it affects people's judgment of what it's going to be like. And we get pleasure. You drink with your eyes.
Absolutely.
And that's something I'd learned in Poland. In Argentina, I think I learned about this idea of you're going to have to think outside the box sometimes.
Yep.
Because their access to ingredients. And in Brazil, taking that Latin attitude, so there's just this sort of wildness that what they want to put in their beer, and the freshness of local fruits.
I had some very innovative beers when I was down there. It was fantastic.
And certainly at the homebrew level, and some of I think you brought back the same of that lambic that I did.
I did.
And I finally opened one of those bottles the other day, and the depth, another thing that I think is important in brewing is the less is more idea.
Yeah.
When you drop some of those things down, you get other flavors you wouldn't have noticed. That was really a less is more lambic.
Yeah, the passion they're bringing to it is just amazing to me.
So it is great.
Yeah. We enjoyed having Mr. Stan Hieronymus here. We're coming to you from the floor of the National Homebrew Conference, and Stan, of course, is the author of Hops in the Brewing Element series, and Brew Like a Monk, perhaps the definitive Bible on brewing abbey ales. And Stan, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm honored.
Take care.
As always.
Well, a big thank you to brewing author Stan Hieronymus for joining me at the National Homebrew Conference for an interview on brewing around the world. Today's podcast again was sponsored by How to Brew with Malt Extract, the film that I jointly made with John Palmer. This video, intended for new brewers, you can find at beersmith.com/DVD. Again, that's beersmith.com/DVD. And our other sponsor, of course, is Craft and Beer Brewing Magazine, which you can find at beerandbrewing.com. This magazine is packed with great material for all brewers, 120 pages. The latest issue has saisons, Belgian beers, blending beers, and much, much more. You can go to beerandbrewing.com and order your subscription today. You can get 20% off if you use the exclusive offer code BeerSmith. Again, 20% off if you use the exclusive offer code BeerSmith. Go to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine at beerandbrewing.com to place your order today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.